Welcome to another edition of More Movement in Omaha for Race Equity, which is an organization, nonprofit that works on race equity as well as anti-racism. And this is a series of programs that we're doing with community people as well as people nationwide to talk about some of those issues that are dear to our heart. And particularly in this day and age, we're really much concerned about that. And today we have a conversation between the two of us, Dr. Patrick Velasquez, who have been known for a number of years, and we've done a couple of shows related to some of these issues, social justice. So I wanted him to come on and have a chance for us to talk about the phenomena of what's happening in our society today, exchange some concepts and ideas, as we would say, do a little better in of compatible ways to talk about issues that are important to our not only our community, our respective community, but our society. So again, Dr. Patrick, welcome to More, and as we go forward on these issues.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I want to just start off by saying I've been kind of concerned about what's happening in terms of our society, the lack of quietness and so on. And I know you recently wrote a piece that appeared on the page that dealt with this whole issue of this insurrection. And today I've heard other people use different terms to describe it and so on. And I want to get your bent on, what do you think about that? I mean, there are a lot of people who are shocked. I'm amazed at the number of folks who are backtracking now that they stopped this insurrection and these racist people who are doing that. But what did you think of it, particularly from that piece that you wrote and we posted on our website, from a kind of I want to call it like a layman's perspective, because I know the piece you wrote was extensive, but there were some areas in there that really resonated with me. So give me a little overview of what made you possess you to write that. And number two, how would you, from your point of view today, how do you see that?
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that. It is really my perspective is as a lay person. I consider myself a scholar of higher education, and this didn't really have anything directly to do with higher education. So the conceptual and theoretical lenses that I use, they had limited application here. So one thing that struck me was that I have some friends on Facebook that had been warning about this for a long time. These are Chicanos here in San Diego. And I have to admit, man, that there's a big part of me that didn't believe that all these kooks that worship Donald Trump would actually commit violence, that they would do something as radical as to storm the Capitol and literally try to overthrow the United States government. I mean, I knew they were out there certainly, and again, I know they're not in possession of their faculties, and they're blinded by so much racial hatred and so forth, that they follow Trump. So I wasn't surprised that thousands of them would be out there protesting the decertification of electoral college votes. But I was surprised, man, when they actually threw down and stormed into the Capitol and committed all kinds of acts of violence against the police, of all people, the ones they supposedly worship, along with Trump, and all the violence to property there in the Capitol. So, but then as I wrote, when I started to think about it, it's not like you or I or our communities storming the Capitol and trying to do the same thing, because we would have got mowed down like blades of grass if we had tried it. But I'm sure in the back of not even the back, the front of their minds, all these white dudes knew that the white cops were not going to do anything to them. And then when you project it even further, analyze it deeper, the fact that so many of these white supremacist terrorists that actually took over the Capitol for a while, there's a lot of them with law enforcement backgrounds, or that have close relationships with law enforcement, and that also a lot of them, maybe even the majority, are military veterans. And thinking about this as I wrote, that you can imagine, man, if you were a leader in a white supremacist organization and you wanted to recruit and develop and train members that knew how to commit acts of violence and use arms and have access to guns and so forth, the two ripest places for you to go would be the military and law enforcement. And there was a report, my understanding, a report issued in 2015 by the FBI that said that they were very concerned about the infiltration of these radical white supremacist groups into law enforcement across the entire country. So the more I thought about it, the more I thought, yeah, it wasn't really that much of an act of courage And then you see the video of the cops in many cases just letting them come into the Capitol or even waving them in. And one cop who amazingly to me is being hailed as a hero, he turned around like a scared rabbit and ran. And again, if those were people of color, he would have unholstered his gun and started blasting. And so, in that sense, my reaction has changed, and I've thought about it a lot. I wrote that initial essay the weekend after the riot, and then I wrote another shorter essay just a couple of days ago where I reflected on the violence and even the culture of white folks. As a scholar of higher education, I've always been very interested in the way that culture impacts educational experiences. And one of my primary research interests is the way that Chicano culture helps Chicano students to actually negotiate higher education and be more successful. And so my interest in culture has made me reflect a lot about the culture of white folks, because I think most of us who are people of color, we reflect on ideas like the Black community or the Chicano community or the Native American community. And so we assume that we are part of a community with a common culture, even across the whole country. But we very seldom think about white folks in that same way, man. That we could talk about the white community or about white culture, and we really get into the specificity of what they are and what's important to them and how they behave and so forth. So I wrote about that a little bit. There are, of course, now numerous scholars in higher education that write about whiteness. One of them was a guy named George Lipsitz, who taught at UC San Diego, where I worked for 28 years. He was a white dude himself, George Lipsitz, and he wrote a book called The Possessive Investment in Whiteness, all about how white people construct their own white identity and use it to achieve privilege and maintain privilege in society. So yeah, this has really made me think a lot about the state of the country and just what we're dealing with here.
Pat, as you said that, one of the things that hit me, there's two things. One is when I think of whiteness, I think of ethnic identity. So in other words, when you say you're Irish, you're Czech, you're Polish, or whatever, in that sense, it's like a European culture. But when you say whiteness as a monolithic issue, I think of supremacy. And again, when a white person say I'm white, I'm proud and I'm white, we already know where they're coming from and what they are about. Particularly when it's a dominant oppressive group. And I saw somebody on Facebook recently allude to that, and I basically raised the issue is that how can you be proud of something that's been so oppressive or whatever, particularly if you bring it away from your tribal or your ethnic identity. Whereas as an African or Latino or Chicano person, we talk about it in terms of where we've come from, particularly in terms of our survival. But the book that you talked about, I have a copy of it. I haven't read it. And there's a number of books I'm starting to deconstruct. There's some other books out on whiteness. But one thing I want to go back to is something you said is how Chicanos navigate post-secondary education and their identity. And what my experience in African Americans is that oftentimes when a person who's very Afrocentric goes to the universities or Black studies or whatever, they get shaped by that system if they don't have a way to go back to it. And so I'm go back to our days back growing up. We would go into oppressive, brainwashing educational system. I would call it the Omaha Plantation School, and they would give us that Europe-centric crap or whatever they would give us, and they would do things to us or say things to us. And the only thing that kept us rational or sane is we had a family we went back to and we interact to. And one of the things that I find somewhat painful, and I talk about this, where people who are of color who live in sometimes small towns or in Lincoln, Nebraska, and they're surrounded with a bunch of barbarians who hate people of color. And again, there are many racists in many of these institutions, but they come out with this same Trumpite mentality. It shapes the ethnic identity. And again, if you look at the university people of color, many of them ain't worth a crap of nothing. I mean, they're not even worth snot in terms of them dealing and promoting our culture. Now, don't get me wrong, there's some scholars there. But what good is that scholarship if it doesn't train back to our salvation and the promotion and promulgation of our group or our species to survive this American nightmare, as Malcolm X says. So one of the things that I find fascinating is how do we negotiate that and how do we talk about it? Again, I want to be very careful. I'm not denigrating someone because of factors beyond their control. And I'll use one quick example. I used to call racists crackers. And my wife told me one day, you shouldn't be calling people out of their names and saying things like that, because that's negative. You wouldn't want to call your name. So then my younger brother says, no, don't call them crackers, call them saltines. Well, it was kind of a joke or humor there. But my point is, at the end of the day, I shouldn't have to call anybody anything. You can tell what they're about by how they treat people, how they let you sit at their table or our table, vice versa. And most of us, we bring somebody in our house, and I'll use you as example when you and I used to hang out back in the days at the County Awareness Center, and I love talking about people thought I was an immigration agent. Then they saw me hanging out with you, said, well, he can't be bad. He hanging out with Patrick, he's close to him, So they treat me like I was compadre and all the other stuff because they knew I was with somebody like in the family, like in Africa. And I assume the same thing happens all over the world with indigenous people. So part of what I'm saying is if you ain't connected to the group and you don't have no sense of allegiance, then you lose your ways and you don't know how to navigate. And that system brainwash you, because you've alluded to in many of your papers, scholars, people you've seen who are Chicanos, and you're like, what? Where are they coming from? And even in your work with students. So I see the same thing here in Omaha, and I'm always blown away by when I go places, how connected we are to our roots as a people, and particularly we use La Raza, most of us know what that's about, but we are the people. And if we're not about that, then what are we about? And that was a question I had for you. I was going to come back to something. You suggested something that I found strange in one sense. You came out and said being white is synonymous with being capitalist. And you bring that capitalist economic theory in there as if you can't separate them. And I didn't understand that, because at one point you did the same thing with Catholicism. You said being a Chicano for some people are Latino, and Catholicism is one and the same. And some people are wedded and they don't see them as separate. So can you explain a little bit to me more? What do you mean by that when you say white and capitalist? They can't be broken apart, or is that just part of their genetic structure?
No, they're distinct. I mean, you can have capitalists, obviously, that are not white. There are black capitalists, there are Chicano capitalists. But I know, and I suppose, hypothetically, there are white socialists in the United States, although I think they're pretty few and far between. But no, my reflection was, and I thought about a Chicano poet, one of the famous Chicano poets from the Chicano movement in the 1960s and 70s. His name was Alurista. And in fact, he did a guest teaching appearance at the University of Nebraska at Omaha for a couple of months, back for the Goodrich Scholarship Program back in the day. And I heard Alurista give a presentation, and they asked him to reflect on I think the question was American culture, but they really meant white culture. And he said there's two things that make up American or white culture: capitalism and Christianity. And I think there was a lot of accuracy in that, and as I think about what are the values that that the white community, I'll refer to it that way. What are the values that are most important to the white community? Interestingly, Joe Biden brought this up in his inaugural address today. He said, as a country, we have to think about the values that we hold most dear. And when I look at the actual behaviors of the white community, I would say the things most important to them are money, material possessions, and the status, especially the status that they accrue by having money and material possessions. And there have been scholars that have written about this, that have talked about the dedication that the white community has to amassing personal fortunes, and it seems to drive everything. And again, when you talk about the most conservative elements of the white community, they are diehard pro-capitalist to the max. I mean, pretty much wanting unfettered capitalism with no regulation, etc. And so I think that this is something that didn't happen overnight. This is part of the long historical development in the United States, where the white community essentially developed as a capitalist community. I'm reading a book right now on the Lakota nation of indigenous people in the United States, and how they were trading a lot with the French colonial merchants and the British merchants. So the first white folks that came here were heavily invested in capitalism, and that was part, I think, of where the world was in its evolution at that time. If you follow Marxism, that Marx, I think, explained that the world evolved through different economic systems. And so we were very much in a capitalist period at that time. Late 19th century, early 20th century industrialization. And so at a certain point, I think capitalist values and principles became the heart and soul of the white community's culture. And I think that's where we're at today. One of the ways you can see that, I think, is that within capitalism, there's a principle that's basically all about individual freedom. You're free to amass as much money as you want. You have no obligation, unlike in collaborative cultures, like in a lot of Mexican culture, African cultures. There's no obligation to contribute to anybody but yourself. You have no obligation to lend a hand to anybody. You can just amass as much as what you want and do it by any means necessary. So I think that it's really become more than just an economic system. It's become the major part of the white community's culture in the United States.
you know, Patrick, as you say that, there were two things that resonate with me. Once I had a conversation with a professor from Bellevue University, and I've never heard anybody say this before because it shocked me. We were having kind of a general conversation about issues related to race and diversity. And she said to me, unfettered, but very clear, she said, I've never done anything for anyone that I didn't get something out of it. I've never heard anyone say that, particularly an academician at a racist institution like Bellevue University. So I was floored because I'm like, did I mishear that? And she basically repeated in a different area. She said, I'm always maneuvering how I can get something out of it. I'm like, wow. And this person's teaching younger people and they got that mentality. And then the second thing that hit me, and I had a professor friend of mine said she didn't like kids and didn't want to have kids. And it's like, I don't got no, therefore I got to save extra money when I get old. I got to use my money to pay somebody to take care of me. And I never thought of it like that. And again, to your point you just made, and there will always be people who say there are exceptions to the rule. But your point is well taken in that if you're not out here doing it for the common good and addressing some of the inequalities, and you see people starving to death, yet you got some clown like Trump who's sitting here flying into his golf course every other week, but yet he was criticizing Obama when he took a meager vacation. Not that I think they should be taking the vacation on my dime and putting that plane up in the sky, and I got to pay tax to support them while they're flying like that. But I think we have to have this discourse. The last point I think related to this is, Patrick, and this is what point I'm sometimes nervous is, how do we have these conversations without someone denigrating you for a point you raised that's in front of us? Like when Malcolm X talked or Martin Luther King, and some of people don't remember, Martin Luther King was the most hated person in America at the time he died. And I even heard on public radio about maybe a few weeks ago where a guy said his father had the same replica of a gun that killed Martin Luther King. And when he asked his friend's father what that was about, he said it's a replica. He was celebrating it. Now, again, these are the same racist saltines who play like they're friends of King. And at the same time, they don't want to have this conversation. And you and I have this conversation, we can't sometimes get it in public airways or whatever to do it, or we get censored. So I find that strange, but I think we got to figure out how to drill down so that our voices become the norm in post-secondary education, because I'm not gonna lie to you. Half the people who look like you and I see them going to the university, I wave them goodbye. Because all I'm gonna ask you is a simple question. What have you done in the past year, 3 things for our people, La Raza? And then that's a simple question. You make the decision what it is, and can they name it? And can you name it, as we say? And these are the kind of things we say. And you and I both know what it's like. We're the only one in the room pushing back. It's not easy.
No, and I wish I had the answer to how we can penetrate the media more. Trying to find, a progressive voice on television is about the hardest thing in the world, man. I have a colleague from the university here in San Diego that he posted something on Facebook. I don't know if it was facetious or not, but he said that the National Basketball Association, the NBA show on TNT, is maybe the most progressive voice on television. This was Charles Barkley and Shaquille O'Neal, and Kenny Smith. Between the 3 of them, I don't think there's one brain. And I said, you got to be kidding, man. But I said, at the same time, I admit, what is the most progressive voice on TV? I mean, I ended up spending a lot of my time getting my news from MSNBC, And I went to see Cornel West speak here in San Diego one time, and he referred to that station as Milk Toast MSNBC. And I thought, yeah, that's a damn good description for them. And man, you almost never hear a Chicano voice on that TV. You got people like Nicole Wallace, who used to work for George W. Bush.
Right.
She got her own TV show, man.
Right.
And the only Latinos, if you want to call them that, they put on there are these what we call gusanos, which is Spanish for worms. They're the people that fled Cuba. This guy Jose Diaz Balart, who you see on MSNBC or even NBC a lot, who's a very anti-Castro, anti-Che Guevara sellout. And those are the people that you find representing the so-called Latino voice on MSNBC. So, I tried to watch the Al Jazeera channel for a while to see if that would be more progressive, and it didn't really seem to be. So, yeah, I don't know how we penetrate the voices here. The local media in San Diego is I would say almost as bad as it is in Omaha.
Wait, how many Latino Chicanos in San Diego? I thought your numbers was pretty high.
Well, we're about, I'd say San Diego is about twice the size of Omaha as a city or metropolitan area. And we're about 30 to 35% Chicano.
That's a significant number.
That's a very significant number. And of course, we didn't just get here yesterday either. This part of California, like all of California, used to belong to Mexico. So, which a lot of people don't know. But so even here locally, there are not really progressive voices. You see a lot of Chicano faces on the local news out in the field doing reporting, especially now while it's dangerous. And the white anchors tend to kick back in the studio. We're safe, right? There's a few Chicanos, but yeah, man, that's a major issue that we have as communities of colors. How do we get a much more radical, progressive perspective out there to where, as you say, man, when it's out there, it's isolated and perceived as inappropriate, because
Right.
people aren't used to hearing that.
Matter of fact, one of the things that I find strange, you alluded to this, you talk about the form of white supremacy and so on. And I guess the thing that I'm always wrestling with, Patrick, and I don't know how to answer this myself, but how do you break into that or challenge it or expose it? And you just alluded to the fact that sometimes we have a hard time getting our platform on the table, particularly mainstream media. But as someone who's worked for many years, how do you plant the seed to push back or even define this level of white supremacy so that the average person in our respective communities can understand that it's not in their interest to protect these kind of people who are law enforcement and people who oppress our people historically?
Mhm. It's very difficult, man. And, obviously none of us can do anything by ourselves. If we're not part of a group or an organization, then we're just one voice out in the wilderness and we can't it's very hard to get anything done. And I know you and I are both people who we want to do actual work, right? We want to make change. We don't want to sit around talking to ourselves. And so how do we do that? How do we make change? And for me, what I've tried to do, and I think had some limited success, is to find like-minded individuals, people who do have a radical progressive perspective and are willing to articulate it. Now, you and I have both seen many times somebody who, when they might be talking to us, comes on like they're the second coming of Emiliano Zapata or Malcolm X. And then you get them in a meeting with white policymakers, and all of a sudden they can't even figure out how to make their lips move. And so I can't tell you how many times I've seen that, man.
Oh yeah, no, I see it all the time, and it's almost strange. And I tell the story of, it's like when you and I were in a meeting years back, and I think it was an OPS, and the school official called that song by Native Americans, Cherokee people, as Native American music. And then we had some Negro or bootlicker in the room, and we all planned our plot. And when it got to my part, I did my part, you did your part. And then this other person, I'm not gonna mention her name today, she went cold. She didn't do nothing. And again, you were left in the room because that was part of our scheme. And we can talk about that almost 30 years later or so, 35 years later. But she never apologized, nor did she come through, because we had planned as a group how we would handle that. Now, I'm not gonna mention name, but she had a brother working in the system. He subsequently retired with a big lucrative pension from OPS. But that's the kind of stuff we've been dealing with. And then I had a chance to read Whitney's Young book. The guy who used to be the head of the Urban League started it. He was in Omaha at one point. He started here, and there were some stories about things about him being a bootlicker and what he did. Again, people are dead, and so we have to be careful not to malign people who are long gone and can't defend themselves. But all we got to do, Patrick, is look at reverse engineering. If you see the condition of our people, somebody ain't doing what they got to do. Last point that I would say on this one is, for me, is we sometimes have to have racists and Trumpites so we can do battle with them. I think our claim to fame sometimes when you go toe to toe, it's like boxing. When you got the best boxers in the room and they kind of bring out the best in each other. Sometimes we got these folks, and the reason I say that is because I met some white fragility woman who basically said, I don't want so-and-so to apply for the job because they're more qualified than me and I want the job. Well, that's a pure example of white privilege. And that's what happens where almost every job I've had in my life, my bosses have always made 1/3 to double my salary, even though sometimes I've had more formal education and experience in them. And I tell the story of Catholic Charities. When I got hired, they paid that one person $7,000 more than me. I wrote a hot letter, and then within a matter of a week, I got a $7,000 increase. Again, part of that goes back to that privilege, and many didn't want to acknowledge that. But going back to our people, how do we as a people talk about it and articulate it and do what they do to us, bad cop, good cop routines, which we some kind lose our heart, and that's part of the challenge for us.
Yeah,
Even today.
it's difficult to hold people in our communities accountable, but I really feel that we do this. And I can't tell you how many times that I've told people here in San Diego, Chicanos, the story of what you told me about when you were in the Peace Corps, you were in Botswana, and what was happening in South Africa. And I told some Chicanos, they were telling me, Patrick, you shouldn't be calling Chicanos sellouts and tiohtacos and so forth. And so I told them the story of the South African necklace that you told me. And I said, in South Africa, when there was white minority rule, that there were so many snitches among the black majority, and they did so much damage. If they snitched on a black activist, that person would be murdered,
Right.
literally. And so sometimes the black community in South Africa would find one of these snitches and take a pile of old tires and stack it on top of them and light them on fire. And they were just aghast when I told them that. And I said, well, put yourself in their place, man. If your mother or father or son or daughter were killed because somebody snitched and told the white minority government that they were black activists, you mean to tell me you wouldn't consider something like that? And so I'm not suggesting that we reenact that here, of course, but man, we've got to do something. A problem we have in Southern California is a number of Chicano legislators in the state assembly and the state senate that don't really do much for our community. And they make a lot of promises when they're campaigning. And when they get in, you don't see any legislation coming from them that really directly impacts our community. And I've had some lie in my face. We met with them and they made promises to help us out. And then later on, they come back and tell us, sorry, I'm afraid I can't do that after all. So that's just one of many chores that we have.
But Patrick, your point is well taken from a historical and whereas a cultural point of view. Back in the day, and I'm using back in the American, what they did to traders, the American Civil War, what they did to traders. Both sides, even in the case of war, they shot the people who betrayed them, particularly when they were on their side fighting. And we have some of the lowest regards for traitors. I mean, that's part of life. And I think that's what happens in our communities of color. And what I often allude to is that one of the reasons we don't deal with drugs and gangs and violence sometime in our communities because sometimes people who are righteous won't deal with it. But the other issue is that if you're part of that criminality doing it and you snitch on someone, they will deal with you a certain way. What I found out, and I'm not trying to be funny, is that I found out from my sources that sometimes the police officers tell the other gang members who snitched on them. So then therefore they don't put them in the victim witness protection program like they do white folks. And again, they wonder why sometimes crime stays in our community when we want to get rid of some of that crime, and some of the crime is not really crime. In other words, victimless crime is different. And when I heard a police officer say to me in a meeting, and I bet you there was a Latina in the room, will not admit this maybe in public. He says, I will give the person a chance to clean their pockets out. This is a white police officer saying that in the room. She was the only person, and then I was the only person of color there. I don't know if she's really a person of color, because it depends on how you define yourself and so on, because sometimes people don't do that. But when I repeated someone, they said, you didn't hear that. I did hear that. And my point, I asked that officer in front of everybody, are you going to go public on that? And he says, no, of course not. And that's the reason why our criminal justice system has so many Black and brown folks locked up in it as a cottage industry. And these judges give us like life sentence and 20 years and 30 years for stuff that you get less time. But those white people oftentimes get less. And even if you look at Trump, I mean, look at him. How many people he pardoned? And some of the people he pardoned was obvious guilty and admit their guilt. So what does that say to us about the criminal justice system? As Mondo said, it is appropriately named. It is a criminal justice system because it does criminal things to us. And again, I'm not supporting crime in a certain sense, but I think that we got to be conscious that we can't putting mental health people who have mental health problems in prison for 30 years for something they need mental health, or somebody has substance abuse, that and so on. I was going to switch up and ask you a question that I found somewhat perplexing. And again, I wrestle with it all the time, again, as we deal with racial and so on and systems like that. What would be your vantage point of dealing with helping law enforcement to see the light? Because there's a times I think we both talk that we have hope, or we have some sense of expectation that we might convert them. But then sometimes I hear you say things like, some people are hopeless. So in light of the fact that law enforcement has so much contact with its judicial system, the county attorney, the public pretender, I said public pretender, because obviously it's obvious they do some crazy things. What do you think we can do? How do we reverse that, particularly when we're in that system?
Man, what's happened in the last couple of weeks, the riot at the Capitol just really reinforced how difficult this is, man. It's almost like, we have to, no matter how scary the idea of defunding the police is, that has to be completely rethought. The whole idea of law enforcement. I mean, it was bad enough what they were doing historically and at the present time, all the people of color they're killing. And I'm not just talking about cops. I'm talking about in the case of like California communities. It's not the only one, but I'm talking about the Border Patrol as well,
Okay.
which is a real
People were
menace.
trying to get in the country, they kill them?
Well, yeah, they have killed undocumented Mexican immigrants crossing the border. There was one high-profile case where they killed a guy. They tasered him so many times and killed him. And so, not to mention just the consistent harassment of Chicano communities by the Border Patrol. I mean, man, as far away from the border as Omaha, I can remember living there, and I think they had one Border Patrol agent to patrol the entire state of Nebraska, but he was all over the place in Omaha, man, in South Omaha. He would park outside the Lady of Guadalupe Church during Catholic Spanish-speaking mass. He would park outside the laundromat in South Omaha, where a lot of Mexican women took their clothes to clean. And so this has been obviously a very consistent part of the Chicano experience. And now we're seeing, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that so much of law enforcement has been affiliated with these white supremacist organizations. Man, it's not like I had a high trust in police before this, but I will never trust a cop from now on, man. I mean, every time I see a cop now, I have to wonder if he or she is a member of the Proud Boys or the Three Percenters or just a flat out Ku Klux Klan. The
Right.
Klan operates in San Diego County. And so you've got all these border patrolling militias, vigilante groups in San Diego and cities along the border. And so, yeah, how we deal with them, boy, that's a tough one. I think as much as possible, we have to figure out some way to start all over again. And somebody was making the point that this is not a training issue. Some people say, well, it's in the way that we train police. But again, the problem is that the police have been socialized in this racist society to view white people, even the rioters at the Capitol, they view white people as the people they're charged to protect, and people of color as the people they're charged to control.
Right.
So it's a dichotomy of protect one population, control the other populations. And so on that, it's almost like we need to start all over again with a whole new police force that's recruited in a different way. I'm not, again, I'm not a criminal justice scholar. I don't know much of anything beyond a layperson's knowledge of policing and law enforcement, other than having the experience myself of being beat up by cops when I was a teenager. But man, there have to be alternative models in other countries of law enforcement that are more humane and more equitable and more effective than the one that we use in this country. And I hope that the Biden administration puts a priority on that. I was very sad to see this guy Merrick Garland appointed as Attorney General. I think in the current um, you know historical era that we're in right now, that there should have been a member of the Black community appointed as United States Attorney General. Instead, you got this milquetoast white dude who was so centrist that Barack Obama was confident he could get him through as a Supreme Court justice just before his administration
Oh yeah, I
ended.
remember the guy now. Yeah,
Yeah, and so the guy can't be a radical or a progressive.
well, his writings show that he's more Republican centric on that
Yeah,
side. Then
yeah, I
and
don't doubt it.
again, it goes back to the very point that if he wanted to get him on the Supreme Court, and in particular if he was dealing with a hostile Republican group, he's not going to pick somebody who's a member of the Black Panther Party or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah,
And that's what we're facing right now is you got somebody who can't swing or who can't understand his position, how he got his privileged position because it was political.
yeah. And I keep hearing over and over again that there was a two-page spread in our local San Diego paper 2 weeks ago about changes in law enforcement, and they interviewed a couple of local police chiefs, but they also interviewed a lot of activists, a lot of members of the San Diego Black community that have been fighting really hard and protesting for changes in law enforcement policies and practices. And the members of the Black community were mostly saying, nothing happened, man. All our protests and all the promises that
Right. Still, it's still the same
nothing really happened.
blue line. It's
Yeah,
still there.
very minor reforms. And what the police chiefs were saying over and over again is people just don't know what a tough job it is to be a cop. And my response is then don't be a cop.
Right.
If you can't handle it, don't be a cop.
Right.
Just like that guy at the Capitol that ran away like a scared rabbit. Man, if you're not willing to give up your life in defense of the people you're supposed to protect, don't become a cop. It's not for everybody. And you've got to do a much better job. Maybe they need to be paid more, but you do a much better job of recruiting the right kind of people, because I don't argue that it's a difficult job, aside from all the cops that I see sleeping in their cars or eating donuts and so forth. But I know there are hard parts to the job, and again, man, if you're not prepared to do that, that is not an excuse for brutalizing people. That is not an excuse for
Right.
killing unarmed people of color. And so we really need radical change in law enforcement, and it's become, this riot at the Capitol shed so much more light that it's become much more scary as an issue than it was even 2 weeks ago.
As you alluded to, one of the things that come to mind was two things. One, when there was a Hell Angel fight somewhere in Texas somewhere, and they were shooting at each other, and some people died. Some of them, they didn't put cuffs on. They just sat them down. The Texas Rangers were involved, but it shows you the white privilege back then there. So that was one. And then number two, I'm almost thinking you almost have to have somebody like an ombudsman who has a contract for like maybe 4 or 5 years working inside the system, like a public safety auditor who can call them out. Because in Omaha, we had one and they chased her out of the job. They maligned her. Even Tommy Warner, who was the police chief at the time, didn't like her. We was trying to develop what we call an advisory committee to the department. And so what has happened over the years, we've gone backwards, and then they've had some functionary committees the mayor appointed, but they couldn't have any power to do anything, and some people quit it. And so at the end of the day, looking at what happens, we just had an African-American guy killed about 3 months ago, again in Omaha. And so what happened is, I argue in one of my Facebook posting, is that in my lifetime, and I'm 65 years old, going on 66, February the 5th, I like to tell that to the world in case they decide to want to send me a Christmas card or birthday card or something. But my point is, I've never seen one white police officer go to jail for one night. And there's been at least 10 people, including Vivian Strong, the 14-year-old, who got shot in the back of the head and killed by a white police officer. And you don't think that has a traumatic effect on a community and a group? And even one person shared a story to somebody else. His mom heard that gunshot shot when the young girl was running away. So you got people running away, you shoot them in the back, you paralyze them, and this is the kind of justice we get. And we're supposed to support Mississippi Burning, the FBI, and all these other folks who've been covering for each other. Why is it that somebody who killed 4 little black girls, you only bring the guy to trial when he's 99 years old and 50 years later? We all
Well,
know everybody knows what everybody's doing.
I'm not sure how this could be done, but it's very clear that we need a whole different way of dealing with police officers when it's clear that they've done something that's inappropriate and illegal. The current criminal justice system cannot be the thing that investigates that or even tries to mete out justice. So maybe one possibility would be to somehow use a major part of police budgets to set up their own department that investigates police misconduct and not just investigates, but prosecutes it and with its own judges and so forth that would mete out the appropriate punishments. Because I've heard it said that, even if, let's say if a police oversight committee says that a cop engaged in misconduct and they forward it to the district attorney's office, the DAs do so much work with cops and they're so beholden to cops
Right.
that they would never be objective, that they would never rule against the cop. And that's what happens, man. Like you say, it's San Diego's the same way that we have a number of people, usually people of color, that are killed by police every year, and almost none of them are ever disciplined at all. We had one cop in the last month that actually got fired. I'll admit, he got fired, a white cop who pushed and shoved and manhandled a young black man, and it was all caught on cell phone, fortunately. And the cop claimed that the black man pushed him, and the cell phone video footage showed he did not. So they ended up firing the cop, and that's a good thing. And we need
That's the
more.
first time in the history of San Diego, probably,
The first time I've heard of that in my 30 plus years here.
living there. Well, I know in Omaha, it doesn't happen that, even the case where that Native American Bear Hills was killed.
Mhm.
One cop went to another division, another community, Bennington, Nebraska. Another cop got his job back. And the other thing that's egregious or negative is I remember when there was 2 cops arresting some black guy in North Omaha, and one of them planted marijuana on the guy. And the female cop, who was white, they're both white, told on him, went to the county attorney and so on, and they basically dropped the charges because it was her word versus his word and so on. But at the end of the day, we know stuff like that happens. And we watch TV. We know that there are some people who are not doing drugs. Just because you got a credible background don't mean that you've done everything. And I just think that's part of the problem. Patrick, I'm going to switch up and ask you a little bit about the curriculum. And this is something that is a part of our conversation that sometimes, I know you use the word radical. I sometimes use the word logical. And again, I suspect that you have encountered a lot of folks when you're in the academic community, both secondary and post-secondary and so on, and even as you was working your PhD, and you see that you've had to wrestle with some basic stuff because somebody was trying to ramrod some stuff down your throat or come from a different paradigm. And my question is, if you had that magic wand to define the curriculum in these European, Europe-centric educational plantation institution, both secondary and post-secondary, for helping stop the growth of raw ignorance. And again, this affects white folks as well as people of color. And we're talking about people who can think. There's nothing wrong with them. They have, their diagnosis is normal. What would that look like from your perspective? Again, it's a magic wand statement, and it could be realistic because sometimes, you look at Malcolm, you look at other people who came before their time. They think of things, and now we're just starting to implement them in a sense. So talk to me a little bit about if you had to change it. And again, you worked inside them a lot longer than I have. I just came in as an adjunct. They let me teach a class and kick me to the curb when I get too controversial and they don't like what I say. But what would you say to make it better so that you wouldn't have to go through what you went through?
I think there's a real contrast between this and the last issue we talked about in law enforcement. Again, at least for me, as a lay person in regard to law enforcement, I don't know what the answers are there. In the field of education and diversifying the curriculum, I think as a field, we know what the answers are now and we know what works. And the research evidence has firmly concluded that ethnic studies, the study of communities of color in the United States, it is associated with academic success for students of color. I've even seen studies that show that it contributes to the academic success of white students. And so that kind of a good, solid, diverse curriculum has all sorts of academic benefits, as well as something even beyond just the academic benefits of getting a good GPA and graduating. It also gives people the tools that they need to function well in a diverse society. And I always make the case of that here in California, that man, if you're sending the students to a 4-year school like UC San Diego, and they leave without ever taking a course in Black studies or Chicano studies or Asian American studies, you've just sent them out into a society in California that's about close to 65% people of color, and they have no idea on how to interact with those communities. And so it's a miseducation for them even. So I think we know what the answers are. I don't know as much about the elementary or secondary levels, although I've had some interesting experience that tells me that, even elementary school kids are willing and able to absorb conversations about things like racism and race to a much greater degree than people often give them credit for.
Right.
I'll never forget the time when I was living in Omaha and I was director of the Chicano Awareness Center. And we used to get calls from schools all the time saying, "Oh, can you come in and give a presentation about Chicano culture or Mexican culture?" And one lady called me from an elementary school, and I said, "Yeah, I'll do it." And she said, "If you can bring some artifacts or something from Mexico, that would be great." And I said, "Yeah, I'll bring some artifacts, all right." So I brought a book that's called 300 Years of Chicano History. And it showed photographs of Chicanos during the 1800s after the white takeover of the United States Southwest and the theft of Mexican land. It showed a couple of photographs of Chicanos being lynched by white mobs, which happened all over the Southwest. Again, another thing that many people don't know. And I wasn't even sure what response I would get from these elementary school kids. These are all white kids. And when they looked at those pictures, they said, "Wow, why did they do that? Why did that happen?" I mean, they didn't internalize it. They didn't feel
Right.
guilty
Right.
about it. And guilt and so forth is the reaction I would get every time I talked about racism to white adults. But those kids kind of had a clean slate, and they hadn't internalized any white guilt. And so they wanted to find out more about it, man. They were
Right.
asking questions, and they were really perplexed as to why one group of people would murder another group person from another group just because they looked different or spoke a different language. And so I think students all along the curriculum, elementary and secondary, have much more capacity to engage in these issues. I think at all levels, there's two things that are really needed. And I take this from the developmental education about critical thinking, that you need facts and information about communities of color. They need to know about our history, our culture, our present day circumstances and issues. So they need the facts and the information, but they also need to be taught how to critically analyze all those facts and information, how to combine them, how to use them to answer perplexing questions about social inequality, racial inequality, class inequality. And they can't do the critical thinking without the facts and information. But the facts and information are not enough because you don't want just people to memorize and regurgitate that. You want
Right.
them to be able to use that content in order to develop their critical thinking skills. And again, we know how to do that, man. And it's just a matter of institutional will and societal will as to whether it happens or not.
One of the things I always say, that's kind of a habit. I need to stop that. But when I looked at UNO and UNL, some of the most prominent scholars of our culture are white folks, and some of
Mhm.
those very white folks have no contact with our communities. They may have gone on their PhD on Mildred Brown, or Metro the same way, where they have people who really don't deal day to day with people, and it'd be the same way of me being a scholar on women, and I have nothing to do with women. Okay, and you wonder what people say of that. But more than anything is, if you're going to be preserving and talking about it, it means you almost have to be an activist. You have to almost play two roles in a sense. We don't have the luxury of pure scholarship when our people are suffering or dying from basic necessities in our community. But the other thing too is that it's like diamonds sharpen diamonds. So if you don't have people who are constantly on the edge dealing with issues and reading the literature and doing research and that, we got folks who sit around and use Ebony and Jet magazines to teach our kids. And I know that because I've had people tell me about some of these classes they've gone to, or you got people who are basically pawns of the system. And so unless we look at, Dingani and the history of our African folks or Latino folks or Chicano folks and understand the connections to the Native Americans and the Asians, what they went through, there are a lot more of us who's going through a lot more, but you'll never see that whitewash curriculum in a system where people, again, still doing that capitalist thing that you alluded to a few minutes ago. But we have to begin to reverse that. And again, part of it is speaking truth to power. Last point on this one, from my point of view, is I sometimes have to question some of the thoughts that I think of out of the blue, particularly when I'm doing reverse engineering. So when I come to San Diego and I see a whole lot of homeless people, then I'm saying, okay, this must be a strange community. They may not be about this. Or you come to Omaha and you see a lot of people of color in prison, or you go to Lincoln. Well, something's going on here, reverse engineering. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out. You got 400 students who get A's and B's, but yet when you go to the university, you only got 10 to graduate a year of color, maybe 15. Again, I may be exaggerating, but the fact that they don't produce the data or the statistics show me they're hiding something. And we had a affirmative action director here who left town under a cloud of smoke because whenever you ask her for information, she was hiding it or afraid of it. And some universities and colleges are much better about producing that as a barometer or yardstick to move forward. But a lot of these institutions, both secondary, you name it, they hide racial data because they're doing so many negative things against the very people they should be serving. And actually, in fact, it's like child welfare. It's a cottage industry. They snatch a kid out of the family. Our parents may have slapped us a few times or whooped our butt. Today, you do that, you lose your child. And there's some things that can happen accidentally. The burden of proof is on you. And when that court system is all about making money off the backs of the family, I'm not saying that there isn't child abuse. I'm just saying an inordinate number of kids and families of color are dealt with in a very harsh way. And the only thing that helps sometimes the Native Americans is they have a better system with the Indian Child Welfare Act that helps them on a degree with adoption and so on. But we should apply that same act to all people of color in a very racist society as the United States.
Yeah. Yeah, those are issues, and the issue of data that you mentioned is a difficult one because we really need that, and that's one of the best tools that we have to be advocates. And so, there are some, as an example, some institutions in California, including in San Diego. The community college system is very big here in California, and it's what the state points to as its proof that it has open access to higher education for everyone. And so a lot of community colleges I found, they feel like that's all they need to do is just say, we're a community college, anybody in California can attend, it's affordable, we have open access. But the quality of education, we don't know about that. One of the toughest pieces of data to obtain in higher education is the grades that students get broken down by race or delineated by race and ethnicity. We know, for example, at the university where I used to work, that they weeded out a lot of students through chemistry and math classes. And we would ask for data on the performance of students of color in those classes compared to white students. And we wanted the students of color groups delineated because we knew that some populations like Asian Americans did much better than Chicanos and African Americans. At least that seemed to be the case. So, schools don't want to see that, man. They don't want to provide that. They don't even want to see it. What I found is academic departments don't even want to see that information themselves. Mm-hmm. You would think that would be one of the most critical questions right. In self-reflection is, are we achieving equitable results in our classes with the grades that we give out? But yeah, most of them would rather not deal with it. And as you say, when somebody won't give you something, you have to suspect that there's something.
Let's read down to the last few minutes of our show. And I know one of the things I want to do is give us a chance to get closure. Mm-hmm. One of the things I would oftentimes say is that in spite of folks who disagree on some continuum, the conversations are very powerful and important to keep going. And again, sometimes I think about people who can't even have the conversation because, again, in a country that values freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of whatever, one of the things, I'll go back to what you said earlier. When you look at the local talk shows, and I don't even listen to some of them because they get on there and all you do is hear these people yap, yap, yap and say the same old, same old. And I'm talking both sides because I don't see many of the very people who represent grass tops and grassroots and people who push back, you know. So our people basically either have to get their news through other sources, like in my case, the BBC or something else, because the kind of stuff that we're talking about, it doesn't even get the local community access program. By the way, as you know, they eliminated years ago the community access program. They were aiming at Tariq Al-Amin and Senator Chambers and so on, because our elected officials couldn't handle the heat and they couldn't be accountable. And of course, they collaborated with some of those white supremacists. And I use the word white supremacists very freely here because at the end of the day, you got communities who are side by side who don't know anything about them because of that. So I think we have to begin to give people an opportunity through Facebook, whatever it means, to have these conversations. But I really appreciate you doing that. Do you have any closing comments?
Well, I think it's going to be a very interesting time, you know, again looking at this post-Trump era and
Did you
seeing
say
what
post-drunk area or post-Trump
a
area?
little of both maybe, but definitely post-Trump. And you mentioned that you know, using the term white supremacist freely. Well, one thing we know now, we have 7 million white supremacists at least that voted for Trump, and so you know, it's probably more than that. I don't know what the exact number, but all those folks are clearly in that camp. So it'll be interesting to see. There's a number of things that the Biden administration needs to do immediately. And I wrote about this too, that I really hope that he doesn't make the same mistake that Obama did. And the way I always put it is that when Obama took office, they gave the keys to the White House to Obama, and he turned around and gave them to the Clinton family. And he resurrected Hillary Clinton's career. At the time Obama came to office in 2009, he had the Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress, and of course his own administration. And instead of taking advantage of that, you know, he sort of pussyfooted around for a long time, and he didn't do anything to eliminate the blockade of Cuba. He didn't do anything for immigration reform. He put all his eggs in one basket with health care, and that was cool what he accomplished there, but to the neglect of everything else. So I hope that Biden is better advised. I hope that he doesn't do anything that's an overreach in terms of conciliation with the Republicans. That he needs to do what Ronald Reagan did. And you remember when Reagan was elected in 1980, he came in with no regard for the Democratic Party, no regard for the Democratic Party's constituents. As far as he was concerned, working class people, people of color could go to hell.
Right.
And he jammed down all the legislation and executive acts that he could in order to disempower communities of color, set affirmative action back several generations. And I'm not saying that Biden needs to be cruel like that, but he needs to be very, very proactive, both deep and broad in what he does. Some of the people in his administration look pretty bad. I just hate the fact that he appointed this guy Mayorga as the head of Homeland Security, which means he oversees ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And they're calling this guy Mayorga a Latino. His parents were white immigrants from Europe that happened to settle in Cuba, where he was born, and then they come to the United States. That's absurd to call him a
Right.
Latino.
Right.
And he doesn't give a damn about Mexican immigration, you know, as a gusano, one of these Cuban, you know, expatriates. So I'm really sad that that guy's going to be in charge of ICE. Um, but I am heartened by the fact that they've got a pretty progressive Puerto Rican guy in charge of the Department of Education. And they've got a guy who I know is a progressive Chicano, Javier Becerra, who's in charge of health and human services. And because Kamala Harris left California to become vice president, there's now another fairly progressive Chicano politician, Alex Padilla, who's in the United States Senate, the first time that the state of California has ever had a Chicano United States senator. And that's in a state where Chicanos make up about close to 40% of the state population. So So I wouldn't even say really that I'm cautiously optimistic. Of course, we have the pandemic to still deal with, but
Right.
at a minimum, let's say it's going to be a very interesting time. Looking forward, and I have a feeling that in another 2 to 4 weeks, it'll be time for us to get back together again and discuss a number of issues that have come up.
And then we sit back and analyze the issues of the day, particularly after you get to this point in life when you're to give knowledge and wisdom to the younger folks who sometimes don't have it in their existing structure. But
That's
again,
right.
I
That is
really
right.
appreciate it. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much, Patrick Velasquez. It's always a pleasure.
All
And
right.
as they say, may the force be with you.
You too, Holmes.